The rope snapped tight, and the woman stumbled forward into the dirt of the town square, her knees scraping stone as the crowd pressed in a half-circle that left no space to hide and no path to escape. And when the first strike landed across her back, it was not the pain that broke her breath but the sound of approval that followed it, low and steady, like the town itself had decided she deserved this moment, deserved to be bent and shown as an example, and she did not scream because she had already learned that screams fed them more than silence ever could. She kept her head lifted even as her shoulders shook, hair loose and dusty against a face that had been called dishonest, sinful, worthless by men who did not know her name, but knew how to repeat a lie until it felt like truth. And when the sheriff's deputy read out the charge again, spoken loud so no one could claim ignorance, she stared past him, eyes fixed on the far edge of the square where the road disappeared into heat and distance, as if looking long enough might remind her there was a world beyond this moment. The second blow came harder, and someone in the crowd laughed, a sharp sound that cut deeper than leather, while others looked down at their boots, not innocent, just relieved the rope was not around their own wrists today. She tasted blood, copper, and dust, and still she did not beg, because humiliation had taught her that begging only changed the way they looked at you, not the outcome. When she fell again, hands catching her weight, the deputy hesitated just long enough for the murmur to swell, for the ritual to feel uncertain. And that was when the Apache man stepped into the open space without raising his voice or his weapon, moving with a calm that did not belong to this town or its anger. He had been there the entire time, standing near the trading post with his horse's reins looped loose in one hand, watching not with curiosity but with a stillness that felt deliberate. And as he crossed the line the crowd had drawn for itself. The sound thinned, conversations trailing off as eyes turned from the woman to him, because everyone knew who he was and what it meant for him to be here without invitation. He did not touch her. He did not touch anyone. He simply stood between the rope and the hand that held it, close enough that the deputy had to look up to meet his eyes, and when he spoke, it was only one word, quiet and firm. A word that did not ask permission and did not threaten consequence, and that word fell into the square like a stone dropped into water, spreading outward until even the men at the back felt its weight. The deputy faltered, the rope slackened, and the woman realized she was no longer bracing for the next blow, her body still shaking but her back spared, and in that suspended silence she became aware of the Apache man not as a savior, not as a spectacle, but as a presence that refused to let the town pretend this was justice. He looked at her then, not with pity and not with ownership, but with something steadier, something that asked nothing and promised nothing. And for the first time since they dragged her into the square, she let herself breathe fully, because whatever happened next, the humiliation had been seen. And the world had paused long enough for her to stand back up on her own feet. The silence held longer than anyone expected, stretching until it pressed against the chest, and the deputy's hand loosened on the rope, not because he had been ordered to stop, but because he could not remember the last time someone had stepped into the square without fear or noise, and the sheriff cleared his throat as if sound alone might restore the balance of power, telling himself this was his town, and that order was a thing you could name and keep if you spoke loudly enough. Yet the Apache man remained where he was, unmoving, his body angled just enough to shield the woman without touching her, as if he understood that dignity returned faster when it was not grabbed or dragged back by force. The sheriff began to explain, words spilling out about accusations and examples and the need to remind people of their place, and the crowd leaned in again, grateful for the familiar shape of authority, but the Apache man listened without interruption, eyes steady, and when the explanation ended he did not argue the details or demand proof. He asked a single question in a voice that carried without effort, asking who had witnessed the crime with their own eyes, and the square shifted uneasily as people glanced at one another, because repetition had replaced truth so thoroughly that even those who believed the story could not remember where it had begun. The woman stood slowly, pushing herself upright with a hand that trembled, and the Apache man stepped half a pace back to give her space, an unspoken signal that she was not being claimed or hidden, and she wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, lifting her chin toward the crowd not in challenge, but in refusal to shrink. And it was then that some of them saw her clearly for the first time, saw the fear that had been mistaken for guilt, and the restraint that had been called defiance. A man near the front muttered that the punishment had already begun and should be finished, and a few voices echoed him. But they were thinner now, less certain, because the interruption had broken the rhythm that made cruelty feel ordinary, and the sheriff realized with a cold twist that the town was watching him as much as it was watching her, measuring what kind of order he would choose to enforce. The Apache man spoke again, not to the sheriff but to the woman, asking if she could walk, and she nodded, surprised by the simplicity of the question. Surprised that someone had asked her about her body instead of using it to make a point, and when she took a step forward without collapsing, a low murmur passed through the crowd, relief mixing with resentment. The sheriff raised a hand to stop the proceedings, announcing a delay, a review, words that tasted like retreat even as he framed them as prudence, and the rope fell to the ground between them, no longer a symbol, just a thing that had failed to finish its work. As the deputy backed away, unsure whether he was being dismissed or spared, the Apache man turned slightly so the woman could move past him. And she did, crossing the square on her own, every step an act of will, every breath a reminder that she had not been erased. No one cheered, no one clapped. The crowd parted just enough to let her through. And in that narrow passage she felt the weight of eyes that no longer felt entitled to her pain. And when she reached the edge of the square, she paused, not to thank anyone, but to steady herself. And the Apache man followed at a distance that respected her space, a quiet presence rather than a shadow. Behind them, the sheriff called the town to order again, trying to stitch the day back together with routine. But something had been altered, a small fracture running through the certainty that punishment could be carried out without witness or consequence. And as the woman turned down the road that led away from the square, she felt the ache in her back and the sting on her face. Yet beneath it all, there was a new sensation, unfamiliar and fragile. The knowledge that someone had seen her humiliation and chosen not to look away. And that knowledge settled into her like a promise she did not yet understand, but could not ignore. She did not look back as she left the square, because looking back would have meant checking whether the pause would hold, whether the town might decide to reclaim its anger once the tension thinned, and she had learned that hope was safest when carried quietly. So she kept her eyes on the road ahead, each step measured, each breath counted, while the Apache man followed far enough behind that no one could say she was being escorted or taken, close enough that no one dared test the space he occupied. The street narrowed as the noise of the square faded, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a town pretending nothing unusual had happened. Doors opening and closing, a wagon creaking, someone calling for a child, and the normalcy pressed against her nerves like a lie that wanted to be believed. Her legs shook as the rush of fear drained away, pain blooming fully now that she was no longer bracing against the next blow, and she stopped beside a hitching rail, gripping the post until the world steadied, ashamed of the weakness but too tired to hide it. And when she turned, she found the Apache man had stopped as well, leaving a respectful distance, waiting without impatience or instruction. He asked if there was a place she could rest, not offering his own and not assuming she had nowhere to go. And the question startled her because it acknowledged a life beyond the square, beyond accusation, beyond the roles the town had assigned her, and she answered honestly, telling him there was a shed behind the livery where she sometimes slept when the nights were too cold to stay outside, the words coming out flat because she had long since learned not to dress need in emotion. He nodded once, accepting the information without comment, and turned his body so that his presence faced the open street rather than her, a subtle choice that told anyone watching where his attention would be if trouble returned. They walked the remaining distance in silence, not the strained silence of fear, but a quieter one, the kind that left room to think. And when they reached the shed, she leaned against the rough wood, closing her eyes as her strength wavered. And only then did he move closer, stopping short of touching her, asking again if she could stand on her own. She said yes, though the word cost her effort, and he set a folded blanket on the ground near her feet, placing it there as if it were an option rather than a command, then stepped back, eyes scanning the alley and the street beyond with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting things out. The gesture undid her more than the beating had, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it assumed she would choose for herself what to accept. And she lowered herself onto the blanket, hands shaking as she adjusted it beneath her, aware of how exposed she must look and how little he seemed interested in that vulnerability. He offered water next, setting the canteen within reach without pressing it into her hands, and she drank slowly, the coolness grounding her, the simple act of being allowed to recover without spectacle, easing something tight in her chest. For a long moment they stayed that way, the town's edge holding its breath around them, and she realized that this, too, was a kind of interruption. Quieter than the one in the square, but just as firm, a refusal to let humiliation be the final word. When she opened her eyes again, she found him watching the street rather than her face, standing guard without claiming credit, and in that restraint she felt a warmth she did not yet name, a beginning that did not rush toward promises or demands, but settled instead into the space where fear had been, steady and patient, waiting for her to decide what came next. The town did not forget what had happened. It only learned to speak around it, and by the time the afternoon heat settled in, the murmurs had returned in careful shapes. People passing the shed with glances that lingered too long, curiosity sharpening into something closer to judgment, and the woman felt it even with her eyes closed, the way the air seemed to tighten whenever footsteps slowed nearby. The Apache man remained close without crowding her, shifting his stance when someone paused too near, not blocking the way outright, but making it clear through stillness that this space was no longer unclaimed, and that unspoken boundary frustrated the watchers more than any shouted warning could have. A boy ran past and stared openly until his mother snapped his name and pulled him along, her grip too hard. Her face flushed with a mix of fear and resentment, and the woman understood then that the town's anger had not vanished. It had only been delayed, redirected, waiting for a safer moment to surface. She sat up straighter despite the ache in her back, refusing to fold into herself, because if she did, she sensed they would take that as permission to resume what had been interrupted. And when she shifted the blanket around her shoulders, the Apache man turned just enough to notice, asking quietly if she needed anything else, the question simple but weighted with care. She shook her head, then hesitated, and admitted she would need to pass through the square again before nightfall to reach the edge of town, where the land opened and the air felt less heavy, the words carrying an unspoken fear of what that passage might invite. He considered this without haste, then said he would walk the same road, not as an escort, but as someone with business in that direction, leaving the choice of timing to her, and the way he framed it eased the knot in her stomach, giving her a path that did not feel like surrender. When she rose, testing her balance, the town seemed to lean in again, sensing motion, and a few men detached themselves from doorways, pretending errands while watching her steps, their interest sharpened by the knowledge that the morning's ritual had been left unfinished. She felt the old instinct to lower her head, to make herself smaller, but she resisted it, lifting her chin as she moved, and when she stepped out from the alley, the Apache man fell into stride a few paces away, close enough to be seen, far enough to leave her dignity intact. The square loomed ahead, quieter now but not empty, and as they entered it together the murmurs rose again, tension threading through the heat, until one of the men who had laughed earlier spat into the dust and muttered that the punishment had been postponed, not cancelled, testing the air with his words. The Apache man stopped walking. He did not turn to face the man. He did not raise his voice. He simply stopped, and in that pause the woman felt the eyes shift from her to him, felt the weight of attention settle where it had settled before, and the mutter died unfinished. She continued forward on her own, heart hammering, every step an act of defiance, and when she reached the far edge of the square, she realized she was breathing hard. Not from fear alone, but from something else. A fragile strength that had begun to grow in the presence of someone who did not try to own her courage or replace it with his own. When she reached the open road and the tension loosened its grip, she turned once, meeting the Apache man's eyes across the distance, and in that brief look passed something unspoken but unmistakable, a recognition born not of rescue but of shared resolve, a quiet connection forming in the space where humiliation had been interrupted and dignity allowed to return, slow and deliberate, on her own terms. They did not speak of what the town had nearly finished, because naming it would have given it more life than it deserved, and instead they moved forward along the road that bent away from the square, the land opening into scrub and wind where the town's voices thinned and the air felt cleaner, and with every step the woman felt the weight on her chest ease just enough to remind her that breathing could be ordinary again. The Apache man walked beside her now, not ahead and not behind, matching her pace without comment. And when she slowed, he slowed. When she stopped, he stopped. A quiet agreement that made the road feel less lonely without turning it into something crowded. Her strength faltered after a while, the delayed pain returning in sharp pulses that forced her to brace herself against a fence post. And this time he asked plainly if she wanted help, not assuming the answer, and she surprised herself by nodding, because choosing to accept care felt different from having it forced upon her. He offered his arm, steady and solid, and she took it lightly, testing the contact as if it might vanish if she leaned too hard. And when it did not, she let herself rest there, the simple warmth grounding her in a way she had not expected. They reached a small rise where the town fell out of sight, and she sat on a flat stone to rest, the horizon stretching wide in front of them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence carrying relief instead of threat. He produced a small bundle from his saddle, salve and clean cloth, setting them down between them and stepping back again, waiting for her permission without looking away from the work he was offering to do. And when she nodded, he knelt carefully, tending to the welts on her back with hands that were gentle and precise. Never lingering, never claiming, treating her injuries as facts that deserved attention rather than proof of weakness. The care was quiet and focused, and in that stillness she felt something soften inside her, the memory of the crowd's eyes fading as his attention remained steady and respectful. And when he finished, he wrapped the cloth securely and asked if it was too tight, adjusting only when she said yes. She thanked him then, the words simple and unadorned, and he inclined his head as if gratitude were something shared rather than received, as if the moment belonged to both of them without debt. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road, she realized that the fear of returning to the town no longer sat at the front of her thoughts, replaced by a quieter question of what she wanted next, And when she looked at him, she saw no demand in his expression, only readiness to walk on if she chose, or to part ways without turning back. That choice settled over her like a promise she made to herself. And when she stood and took his arm again, this time without hesitation, it was not because she needed to be saved, but because she wanted to keep moving forward with someone who understood that love, like dignity, began with restraint and grew stronger when it was allowed to arrive at its own pace. They made camp before night fully settled, choosing a shallow hollow where the wind passed over rather than through. And as the sky dimmed, the woman felt the day's strain loosen its grip in uneven waves, exhaustion replacing vigilance, the kind that came after holding yourself upright for too long in front of people who wanted you smaller. The Apache man built a small fire without ceremony, keeping it low and practical, and when he handed her a cup of warmed water, he did not hover, turning his attention to the perimeter as if the world beyond the light mattered as much as her comfort. And that balance made the quiet feel safe, rather than heavy. She ate a little when he offered food, not because hunger demanded it, but because being invited to take care of herself felt like a way back into her own body. And as the heat spread through her, she found words loosening where silence had been her armor. She told him her name, testing it aloud as if it might be refused, and he repeated it once, carefully, honoring the sound of it without embellishment, then shared his own, brief and unadorned, as if names were meant to be carried lightly. The fire popped softly, and the stars began to appear, and she realized she was no longer counting the seconds between glances, no longer bracing for judgment to return. And when pain flared in her back, he noticed without staring, asking if she wanted to rest more fully, offering his coat not as a symbol, but as a practical answer to cooling air. She accepted, surprised again by how easy choice could be when it was respected, and wrapped herself in the warmth, the weight settling her nerves. He spoke then about the town only in the most necessary terms, explaining the path ahead and the places where trouble might linger, not painting danger larger than it was, and she listened, appreciating the honesty that did not try to frighten or reassure her into dependence. As the night deepened, she felt the edge of fear return in small ways, a crackle in the brush, a distant sound, and each time he shifted position to make his presence clear without drawing attention, a quiet reassurance that did not demand gratitude. When sleep finally pulled at her, she lay back and let her eyes close, trusting the circle of light they had made together. And before drifting off, she realized that what had begun in the square as interruption had become something steadier, a companionship forged not by spectacle or rescue, but by shared attention and the patient work of choosing each other's safety. And in that understanding she slept, the memory of humiliation receding into the dark as the fire held, small but constant, through the night. Morning came quietly, the light easing over the hollow rather than spilling into it, and the woman woke with the disorienting relief of realizing she had slept without dreaming of ropes or voices, her body sore but intact, her breath steady, and when she sat up she found the Apache man already awake, tending the last coals with the same unhurried focus he brought to everything else. He offered her water and a simple meal, setting it within reach and stepping back, and the familiar pattern of choice settled her nerves, reminding her that nothing here was taken for granted. As they broke camp, the question she had been holding finally surfaced, not as fear but as practicality, and she asked what would happen if the town decided the interruption had been an insult that required answer. The words, careful, measured, shaped by experience. He did not dismiss the concern or inflate it, explaining that some would let it fade and some would not, that towns remembered challenges longer than they remembered cruelty, and that she did not owe the place another chance to prove itself, a truth that landed gently but firmly. They set out along a narrower track that curved away from the main road, the land opening into grasses that bent with the wind. And as they walked, she noticed how he watched the horizon, alert without tension, as if vigilance could be calm when it was rooted in purpose rather than fear. When they paused to rest near a stand of cottonwoods, a pair of riders appeared in the distance, slowing as they recognized the shapes ahead, and the woman felt her chest tighten until she realized the Apache man had already adjusted his stance. Not in preparation for conflict, but in quiet readiness, his presence steady enough to settle her pulse. The riders passed without incident, curiosity winning out over challenge, and when they were gone, she laughed softly, the sound surprising her as much as it did him, a brief release that felt earned rather than reckless. Later, as the heat climbed, they came upon a shallow stream, and he suggested stopping so she could wash the dust and blood from her hands, turning away to give her privacy without being asked. And the simple courtesy carried more weight than any promise could have. When she joined him again, cleaner and steadier, she realized that the distance between them had changed, not closing into possession, but aligning into partnership. And she found herself matching his stride without effort, their pace shared. As the day wore on, she spoke more freely, not about the town's accusations, but about the life she wanted that had nothing to do with proving innocence or surviving spectacle. And he listened without interrupting, the kind of listening that made room for the future rather than circling the past. By late afternoon, the land ahead offered a choice of paths, and he stopped, laying out the options plainly, where each led and what it might demand, then waited, hands relaxed at his sides. And in that pause, she felt the truth of what had been building since the square. That love here would not arrive as a declaration or a claim, but as the steady practice of choosing together. And when she pointed to the path that bent toward open ground and new work, he nodded once and turned with her. Their steps aligning as the road carried them forward into something not yet named, but already shared. They reached the outskirts of another settlement by late afternoon, smaller than the first, and spread thin across the land. And even before the buildings came fully into view, the woman felt the old tension stir, the memory of eyes and judgment rising unbidden. And she slowed without realizing it until the Apache man adjusted his pace to match hers, neither urging her forward nor suggesting retreat. Smoke lifted from low chimneys, and a handful of people moved between structures, their glances curious but not sharpened yet into suspicion. And the difference mattered more than she had expected. The absence of immediate hostility, allowing her shoulders to ease just enough to keep walking. At the edge of the settlement, a man splitting wood paused to watch them pass, his expression unreadable, and further in a woman carrying water nodded once. Brief and neutral, and those small gestures felt like openings rather than tests. They stopped near a simple trading shed where supplies were exchanged without ceremony, and the Apache man spoke quietly with the keeper, his words measured, his posture open, making no mention of the town they had left or the interruption that had followed them like a shadow. And the woman realized how deliberate that choice was, how refusing to center humiliation kept it from defining her place here. While he arranged for provisions, she stood nearby, aware of the marks still visible on her hands, and the way a few eyes drifted toward them before moving on, interest giving way to routine. And that ordinariness felt like a gift she had nearly forgotten existed. When he returned, he asked if she wished to stay the night or continue on while the light held, leaving the decision with her as he always did, and she surprised herself by choosing to stay, recognizing the strength in meeting the world without running from it. As they settled near the edge of the settlement, the day's quiet balance shifted when two men approached, their tone polite but edged, asking where they had come from and why they were traveling together. and the woman felt the familiar tightening, the urge to let someone else answer for her. But before the Apache man could speak, she stepped forward and answered herself, keeping her voice steady, naming only what was necessary and nothing more. The men listened, eyes flicking between them, measuring. And after a moment one of them shrugged and said they had enough trouble of their own without borrowing more. The tension easing into something like acceptance. And when they left, the woman realized her hands were no longer shaking. Later, as the sun dipped and the settlement settled into evening, she sat beside a low fire and watched the Apache man prepare their simple meal, his movements unremarkable and careful, and felt a warmth spread that had nothing to do with the flames, a sense that the love growing between them wasn't forged in opposition to the world, but in the choice to stand within it honestly, without spectacle. When he joined her, handing her a bowl and sitting at a respectful distance, she met his eyes and smiled, small but real, and in that shared look passed an understanding that what had begun in humiliation had become something stronger, a partnership tested in public and sustained in quiet. And as night settled over the settlement, she felt, perhaps for the first time, that belonging did not require forgetting the past, only refusing to let it decide the future they were building together, step by deliberate step. The settlement woke to a low tension that felt different from the one she remembered, quieter but sharper at the edges, and by mid-morning word had reached it from the road, carried by a trader who spoke too loudly and too confidently about a town that had been challenged and a punishment that had been interrupted. And the woman felt the shift ripple outward as curiosity hardened into judgment, faces turning toward her with questions they did not yet ask aloud. The Apache man heard it too, the change in cadence, the way conversations paused when they passed, and he did not move closer to her or take a protective stance, trusting her strength while remaining present enough to make clear she was not alone. Before noon, the settlement's headman called a gathering near the trading shed, claiming it was to settle rumors before they settled people's minds, and as they stood among the others, the woman felt the old fear rise again, not of pain, but of being reduced, of having her story told by voices that did not belong to her. The trader repeated his account, embellishing where memory failed him, describing a woman beaten for cause and an Apache who interfered without right, and the crowd murmured, pulled between familiarity with such rituals and discomfort at having them named so plainly. When the headman turned to her and asked if the story was true, the woman did not look at the Apache man for permission or reassurance. She stepped forward on her own, speaking calmly, naming the accusation, the lack of proof, the blows that came anyway, and the moment the rope fell because someone refused to pretend it was justice. And as she spoke, the crowd grew still, the power of a first-hand voice cutting through second-hand certainty. She did not ask for sympathy or forgiveness, only stated what had happened and what she had chosen since. And when she finished, the Apache man spoke briefly, not to defend himself but to remind them that order without truth was only habit, and habit could be broken without breaking a town. The headman listened, weighing faces as much as words, and then said that no punishment would be carried out here without witness and proof. The travelers would be judged by their actions among them, not by stories brought from elsewhere. And the decision settled over the group with a mix of relief and unease, a public line drawn that could not be easily erased. As the gathering broke apart, the woman felt the weight lift again. Lighter this time, and when she met the Apache man's eyes, she saw pride there, not in what he had done, but in what she had claimed for herself. And in that shared recognition, the love between them found its clearest shape yet, forged in public without spectacle, acknowledged without possession, and allowed to stand in the open air where it could not be mistaken for rescue or debt. They did not leave the settlement the next day, not because they were asked to stay, but because staying felt like a choice rather than a test. and the woman found herself moving through the hours with a steadiness she did not recognize at first, helping where she could, speaking when spoken to, letting her presence become ordinary instead of examined. The marks on her back faded into soreness, and then into memory, and when people noticed, they did not ask for explanations, the headman's line holding firm in ways that mattered more for being quiet. And in that normalcy she felt the last grip of humiliation loosen, replaced by something calmer and stronger. The Apache man worked alongside others without announcement, mending a fence, carrying water, listening more than he spoke. And she watched how the town adjusted to him, not through fear, but through familiarity, the way respect grew from consistency rather than display. In the evenings, they sat together near the low fire at the edge of the settlement, close enough that their shoulders sometimes brushed, far enough that the space between them still belonged to both. And when they spoke, it was about simple things: work to be done, weather to come, the shape of days that might follow, plans formed without urgency. One night she told him she had never imagined love arriving without being claimed or rescued, and he answered that he had learned long ago that what is taken rarely lasts, but what is chosen has weight, and the words settled between them like truth rather than promise. When he reached for her hand, it was slow and deliberate, giving her time to refuse. And when she did not, he held it gently, the contact steady and unremarkable in the best way, a public gesture small enough not to invite spectacle, clear enough not to be hidden. A few people noticed and went back to their work, acceptance taking root not through approval, but through indifference. And the woman realized that this was the ending she had not known to ask for. Not a dramatic departure or a final reckoning, but a place where what had been done to her no longer defined her days. As the season turned and the road beyond the settlement lost its pull, she understood that the interruption in the town square had not stopped everything forever, only long enough for something better to begin. And standing there beside the Apache man, hand in hand under the open sky, she felt the echo of that moment settle into a life shaped not by humiliation remembered, but by love practiced quietly, every day, without needing to be proven again. If you had been standing in that crowd, would you have spoken up or stayed silent like everyone else?